And I think that's why some people maybe don't touch on foster care in the first place, because they're worried of having their own hearts broken, right? Because if you think about it, you're like, how sad is that, right? You don't get to see the kids anymore. Their dad's an alcoholic. But the way I see it is I was able to touch their lives, right? Their foster mom was able to touch their lives in a way that they might never have been touched.
Hello, my name is Wing, and welcome to A Work in Purpose. Do you see people who are living their purpose and wondering to yourself, how did they get there? Are you wondering, what is your purpose too? Me too. That is why I am inviting you to join me on this journey. A Work in Purpose is our podcast for igniting and reaching our purpose together. Each week, I'll be sharing a podcast episode of me interviewing people from all walks of life who are working towards some kind of purpose, whether it is with their career, volunteering, creativity, spiritual practices, or just how they approach everyday life. We'll dive deep into their stories to uncover what obstacles they had to overcome to reach their purpose today. By hearing their stories, I hope you will learn from their journey and be inspired yourself so you too can become a work in purpose. Our guest this episode, Jessica Holt, is an elementary school teacher and also an approved foster parent. After spending most of her 20s working in jobs that didn't feel particularly meaningful, Jessica decided to listen to her inner voice to do her part in helping the over 400,000 foster children in the US today. And she did that by being a volunteer for CASA, which is a court-appointed special advocate for kids in the foster system. Listen to this fascinating episode to learn about the inside world of the foster system, why foster kids need a CASA in addition to a foster parent, the steps to take to become a foster parent, and hear Jessica's bittersweet yet life-changing story as a CASA volunteer and her journey in becoming a work in purpose. Hello, Jessica Holt. Welcome to A Work in Purpose podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Wing?
I'm doing fantastic. So I want to ask you, on your journey towards your purpose, which stage would you say you're at?
That's a good question. I'd say I'm at step 3
Oh,
of my journey.
What's that stage for you?
That stage for me is that I am currently a licensed foster adopt parent, but I have not yet started my adoptive family journey.
Interesting. So let's go back though. What would you say your purpose is?
At this point in my life, I'd say my purpose is definitely related to children in foster care and educating more people about what's going on and what they can do to be a part of it. It's something that I hold near and dear to my heart, and I just try to use my own experience to let people know what they can do about it also.
That's fantastic. Tell us more about the foster care system. What would you like the listeners to know?
Okay, so I'm using data from 2018 because that was the most recent published data that I could find. And at that time, there were 437,283 children in foster care in the US alone. And then in California, the beautiful state where we live, there are 52,336 children in care. And I think that this is often just sort of not talked about or not common knowledge. Most people I meet that I start talking to about it, I find they don't know much about foster care, right? They don't really know what's going on. I kind of call it, it's a little secret almost in America, right? And also another interesting fact is that in 2018, there were 14,886 children in care waiting to be adopted in the state of California.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. So what made you interested in this whole foster care adoption?
That's a great question. So I was actually just thinking about this, and I was remembering back to when I was in my early 20s and traveling all about, and I was living in South America, and I lived in Peru. And at the time, there were many children that were on the street or had to work instead of going to school. And at the time, it really struck me that there were many children all over the world that need homes, right? That need care and and I thought at the time, although I was still very young and not ready to be a mother, that adoption would be a really great fit for me. That when I was ready, I would really love to adopt. So it's sort of, I guess, uh, planted the seed in my mind, my young 22-year-old mind. And as I got older and was more ready to start a family, the adoption came back up. And I started looking at different options for adoption because, as you know, there's many ways to adopt a child, right? There's private domestic, there's international adoption, um, and then there's, of course, adoption through foster care. And after doing some research into all of those options, um, the, I guess, education that I received regarding kids in care really touched me, and I decided to go down that path.
Nice, I see. Now, when you were growing up in your family, did you have an experience with foster kids too?
Yeah, that's a good question. So while I didn't have experience with foster children myself, through my dad's side of the family, there was a lot of issues with drugs and alcohol, and a lot of my cousins were in what happens actually a lot, I think, of sort of an informal foster situation where family members were taking them in. For example, an uncle who was an alcoholic couldn't always care for his children, so my grandma would take them in and they would live with her sometimes for years at a time, and were being raised by other family members instead of their parents. And when I started learning about kids in care, it really sort of touched a chord with me because it reminded me of some of my cousin's situations.
Yeah, why do you think the whole foster thing spoke so deeply to your core?
Hmm, that's a really good question. Um, I guess it was sort of a combination of wanting to be a part of the solution instead of part of the ignoring of the problem. Like, you know what I mean? Like taking the problem on head on, and also just um, not wanting for history to repeat itself in my from my own family, and also just the, I don't know, some sort of deep need to give back that I
Mhm.
can't really place. I can't really say why it's there.
You just know that, yes, this is what I need to be doing somehow.
That's yeah. Hmm. And sometimes I can't even define why.
Was it like a quick process, like you woke up one day and realized, oh yeah, this is kind of like is my purpose? Or did you slowly over time realize, as you did more and more and did more research, then it became more clear? What was like
Hmm.
that for you?
That's a good question. So I would say it started in my early 30s, when I was working for a huge corporation. You know better than anyone that my first career was in human resources. And I started to feel like I was not giving back to society in any kind of positive way. I just felt like my life and my lifestyle was just a part of a big machine that just kept running. And I felt a need to change that. And as I mentioned to you earlier, I ended up changing careers to become a teacher. And I also, at that time, it was right around the same time I was processing all of that, that I sort of made the choice to adopt instead of having my own biological children. After I made the decision to adopt, I realized that at the time I still wasn't ready to be a mom and to adopt, but I was doing a ton of research. This is sort of my personality. This is who I am. I overly research a topic before I do something. And as I learned more and more, I thought, well, I'm not ready to adopt right now, but there still has to be something that I can do to help kids in foster care. And it started with me donating to a local agency that worked with kids in foster care, and I would donate things like coats. Holiday time, I would donate toys, and then I felt like this probably isn't enough. I want to actually connect with a child and help them. And then I learned about an organization called CASA, and CASA stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate. It's a volunteer position, and what it is you're somewhere in between a big brother, big sister, and an actual informant for the judge. So you're actually, as it states, court appointed, right? You are appointed by a judge to this child after 6 weeks of training. And it's your job to get to know the child, build a relationship with the child, and then report back to the judge what you think is in the best interest of the child in this case. And not only are you advocating for the child in court with the judge, with your report, you are also advocating for the child in anything they might need. Because one of the big issues in foster care is kids slipping through the cracks. Um, the more you learn about the system, the more you realize that social workers have really high caseloads. They're not able to give enough individual attention to the kids. And oftentimes things get missed and kids don't get what they need. And a lot of times there's resources there for the things they need, but people just sort of pass them by or don't realize it. So that's another aspect of this volunteer position, is to advocate for their needs, whether it's in their schooling, whether it's in maybe a need for more therapy, right? Or a physical need, a medical issue that they need to have addressed. Those are just some examples of some things you advocate for as a CASA.
Can you tell me more about how it works? Like if a foster child doesn't have an advocate, what happens to them in the court typically?
Depending on their age, they a lot of times don't go to court for their case. And so the ones that are in court, making the decisions, right, would be their social worker. They have a lawyer. The biological parents have a lawyer, right? Each biological parent has their own lawyer, and the judge. And in my case, when I was a CASA, my girl's lawyer didn't even know their name when I went to court. Yeah, he didn't even know their name. I told him their names. I'm here with them. And he was like, who?
Huh.
I was like,
Wow.
your next case? So, and also, for example, their lawyer, I called him several times to try to speak with him before court on 2 different instances so that I could update him on some things that were going on. And he never returned my calls.
Hmm. And these are like state assigned lawyers or
That's
private
correct.
lawyers?
Mm-hmm.
And they're
Yeah,
just like overloaded, basically.
that's right. A lot of them have really high caseloads. And it's really hard for a lawyer to do a good job advocating for the needs of the child in court if they can't even remember their
Yeah.
names.
What typically happens if a foster kid has a overloaded lawyer and then they go through the process and falls through the crack? What does that really mean?
So falls through the cracks means they could end up a lot longer in the system than they should. Right? They can end up in foster care a lot longer. They can also go for a really long time with needs not being met. An example being a learning disability, with no one to advocate for them in school. They can also slip through the cracks with medical needs, social emotional needs that aren't being met. For example, one of my CASA girls, she was at a point where they were trying to end her therapy and she started acting out. And I advocated for them to not cut back on her therapy. So that's an example. So someone who doesn't have that kind of advocate for them, imagine their behavior is getting worse and worse. They're having emotional turmoil and their therapy is being cut off by the state. So those are examples of how kids fall through the cracks every day.
And were they staying in family's home at that time or in some sort of institution?
So I can tell you their story. There were two girls when I first started working with them. The youngest one, I'll call her Princess, because as you know, I can't share their names. She was 5, and then her sister, I'll call her Rainbow. She was 7, and they were living with a foster mother.
Mm-hmm.
She was a seasoned foster mother. She had had many kids before. She was fantastic. She set up a great routine with them. She had a lot of structure. She ran a daycare. They had a lot of kids to play with. They were in a great situation, honestly, and not all kids are, right? Not all kids are in great situations in foster care, but they were very, very lucky. And the other thing they were lucky about is that they stayed with the same foster mom through their whole foster care process. And another issue is kids often get moved around in foster care
Mm-hmm.
and they bounce from home to home. And that can be really, really hard on a kid, especially a kid that's already suffered from trauma.
Yeah. So for those two girls, when they were staying with their foster mom, what's typically the foster mom's role? Can they be the advocate too, or is there something prevents them from doing that?
That's a really good question. For a foster parent, it's much more difficult to be an advocate for the child because they are not allowed to read court reports.
Hmm.
They don't have access to any of that information. As a CASA, you have access to all the court reports. You have access to all the, for example, when they first come into the system, they have a psychologist do a study on them. I can read all of the as a CASA, I could read all of those reports. I had a lot of background information into the case that the foster parent did not. And they say it's due to privacy issues. But like you said, the problem is it's a lot harder for then a foster parent to advocate for the child. And while foster parents can write a letter to the judge, they sort of see that as a bias. Whereas from a CASA, they see it as a non-biased source. So the judge is much more likely to take into account um, the report of a CASA versus a letter that a foster parent writes. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you get to meet the foster parents usually?
Oh, I had a great relationship with my girl's foster mom. We still talked years after they were no longer living with her. We still talked. That's how close of a relationship we had. Yeah, we were basically team Princess and Rainbow.
Now, was she well familiar with the concept of having an advocate from CASA, or were you kind of like her first one?
Yeah, she said that she hadn't had a CASA before for her foster children. So at first she was just kind of like, huh. Like the social worker explained it to her, but she wasn't very familiar with it. She wasn't really sure what my role was. Like, did I just take the kids to go have fun, which we did that a lot, or was I, at one point I think she thought maybe they were sending someone to kind of check up on her, like make
Mm,
sure that the foster family was okay, which was not my role at all.
right.
Right? Was not my role at all. So
Yeah. So there
yeah,
was
she
like,
was confused.
yeah. So how did you kind of help with her apprehension and get her to be more comfortable with and supportive of what you were doing?
Yeah. So for me, it started with just building a relationship with her. So, it started with probably phone calls because the whole thing starts with you going and spending time and building a bond with the child or children that you're CASAing for. And so she met me that way, but then I would start calling and talking to her and sort of explaining my role a little more like, yeah, next week I'm going to do this. And then I'm going to use this information to write a report for the judge. Like I would sort of break it down for her. Um, and also when she wasn't sure so she had a surprise visit from the county, and she had thought maybe it was because it coincided with when I started being a CASA for the children. And luckily, I'm lucky that she called me to ask me, right? Instead of just assuming that I had sent them out or whatever. And I just really calmly explained to her that that's not my role. That's not what I do. This must be something, like a standard procedure of the county. And so because of that open communication and relationship building, I think that's how we got past that.
Yeah. Do you know of other CASA advocates that they didn't successfully build that relationship and then bad things happen as a result?
Yes. Okay, so when I first started being a CASA for the two girls, Princess, who was 5, was my CASA kiddo, and I had what's called a co-CASA. So her sister had a separate CASA, and the other CASA, she was very, I feel like, passionate about advocating for Rainbow, but she also was sort of brusque with the foster mom and maybe wanted to kind of almost like go in there and tell her what she should be doing or tell her what to do. So they did not have a good relationship, especially at first. Um, and unfortunately, um, Rainbow's Casa ended up just pulling out after like 2 months. And
Mm.
I don't know if she pulled out because of the relationship with the foster mom, because it was strained and awkward. And I was almost starting to be like their diplomat. Like that's was sort of the role I was taking on. Um, I don't know if that was the reason or not. She said it was because of her own daughter.
Hmm.
I honestly don't know the reason.
So if they don't work out, then the child is just left without an advocate, basically, right?
Unfortunately, yeah, and this is a child who's already had a lot of people disappoint them, you know. And they actually, because I had started building a relationship with Rainbow, I talked to my organization and made sure that they got her another CASA right away, and they did. And then after a few months, that CASA pulled out too, and it was just really unfair to the child. Like I felt so bad for Rainbow, and also at that point, I had built a relationship with her because I was the CASA for her sister.
Hmm.
So at that point, when the second CASA pulled out, I just called my because we have like a supervisor. I mean, it's a volunteer position, so they're not your supervisor, but they just sort of help um, manage
Hmm.
certain CASAs. And I said, I want to take Rainbow too. She's going to be my CASA kiddo also because I'm like, I can't have these these CASAs keep pulling out on her.
Yeah. Is that common for these CASAs to just pull out every so often?
Well, I think what ends up happening is it ends up being, I think it ends up being a little bit different than what people think.
Hmm.
Like some people, when they go into the volunteer position, before you become a CASA, you need to do training for 6 weeks.
Hmm.
And in those 6 weeks, they are very clear with you about what this means and about what kind of situations these kids are in. So a lot of people go into it with great intentions, but I don't think they realize what it's like to be working with a child who's in this situation. You know, like you get to learn all about why they were taken into care, right? Which is usually a devastating story. Like I've never heard of one that's not,
Hmm.
right? And then some of their foster care situations are less than ideal, and think about how heartbreaking that is. It's for a lot of people, it's not what they expect. Also, some people go into it with the intention of being like a savior, right? Like I'm just going to show up and I'm going to save this kid. It's not that easy. And with some kids it takes a little bit longer to build the relationship. At first they might not trust you, you know and so it takes dedication and consistency, and some people aren't really prepared for that. Like they're prepared to show up and be the knight in shining armor, and that's not it's not always that easy,
Mm.
especially working with kids who've been disappointed a lot.
Yeah. What was your first week like?
Well, my first meeting was actually very positive. It was kind of odd because uh, I went with my co-casa, right? Remember, she's had 2 of them. I went with my co-casa. We went to the house. We knocked on the door, and we asked for Princess and Rainbow. And the guy at the door was like, "Oh, well, Rainbow's at the doctor. She hurt her ankle." And we said, "And Princess?" And then she was playing, and she jumped up and she's like, "I'm Princess. I'm right here." And so I went over and met her. She was super sweet and a little bit excited to have someone, come see her. Like we were her only visitors. So she was really excited. And then we actually walked to the clinic where Rainbow was having her ankle looked at and went and met her there. So it was sort of unconventional in that sense that we ended up at a clinic with two little girls. But it also was great because it was a great start to a relationship.
Yeah. How did you describe yourself to them?
That's a good question because they were like, "What's a CASA?" This was their first time in care. They
Mm-hmm.
had just come into care about a month before, and
Mm-hmm.
they had never been in care before.
Mm-hmm.
So because of that, all this stuff was new to them. And they didn't really understand, like, what's the difference between you and the social worker? Like, people that come to our house and, like, who are you? And I explained it to them. They were very young, though. They were only 5 and 7. So I don't think they really got it until probably after about a month of relationship building. That's when they really understood that, like, I'm there to spend time with them. I'm there to get to know them and be there for them, you know, like a sort of also, I mean, another one of your roles is just to sort of be a consistent adult in their life.
Mm-hmm. Why were they in foster care?
So, another fact I'd like to throw out there, about 93% of children in foster care are there because of neglect.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people, when they think foster care, they think abuse, right? They think physical abuse, sexual abuse, they think exploitation. And while that is true, kids do go into care because of that. The majority of kids are in care due to neglect. And neglect can be heart-wrenching, right? Because it's different. It's different than abuse. It's um, it's basically like a child being left at home with no food,
Mm.
you know, a parent leaving and a 5-year-old on their own, you know. Those are examples of neglect, and my girls suffered from some pretty severe neglect on multiple occasions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was the 5th or 6th report when they were finally taken in.
Were their parents together, or were they having issues with drugs or something that made them
Yeah.
neglectful?
So that's a really good question because drugs and alcohol are a big factor in foster care. A lot of neglect issues are related to drugs and alcohol directly, and both of their parents had drug and alcohol issues. Their parents were separated, um, but both of them were. One of them was an alcoholic, and the other one was addicted to meth.
Wow.
Yeah,
So for you to kind of be in their life was a welcome change because they've been neglected in the past.
yeah, and the consistency of their foster mother as well. We were like a team for them, and um, it was really positive. You could tell by the way that they changed. They changed over the next months in incredible ways. So one thing that's amazing about children is how resilient they are. They can go through horrible things and be incredibly resilient when given the chance, right? Just when given the chance to be put in the right situation.
Yeah. So how long were you their advocate for?
I was their advocate. They were in care for about 2 years. So I was with them through their whole case, and they ended up being reunified with their father, um, and their mother's rights were terminated. They were reunified with their father after almost 2 years in care. Almost 2 years, just short of 2 years.
And how many hours per week do you spend with them?
That's a good question. My CASA girls lived about 40 minutes, 45 minutes away from me,
Mm-hmm.
and I would usually see them once a week. That's about what I would do because it was 40, 45 minutes. I was also working full time. And as a CASA, you're also not allowed to bring anyone you know around the kids. So, for example, I couldn't bring them around my family. I couldn't like plan a day with friends who had kids and bring them with me. It wasn't really like that. You had to have this complete separateness um, with your CASA kids and your life, and that can be tricky to maintain. It sounds like not a big deal, but when you're actually like, oh, this weekend, and your friend who has a daughter is like having a get together at the beach, you're like, oh, I'll just bring him, and you can't.
Oh.
Right, so you have to basically carve out special time for your CASA kiddos.
So what do you typically like to do with them?
What a great question. I had so much fun with them. Like, I think in deep down inside, I'm kind of a child myself. And maybe that's why I ended up becoming a teacher too. I'm like, what am I going to do where I can be really immature and silly and nobody's going to judge me for it? um, here's another thing that was just a wonderful experience and sort of talking about what I do with them. So it was probably the second or third time I took them. And so I didn't know them that well yet. They didn't know me that well. We went to lunch and we started talking about, somehow we started talking about the ocean or the beach. And they said, can we go to the beach? And I said, oh, maybe another day. I'm like, it's kind of cloudy out there and you guys don't have your suits or anything. And then the Rainbow looks super disappointed. And she's like, I've never been to the beach. And
Oh.
you have to realize this girl lives 2 miles from the beach, and she grew up about 30 miles from the beach. Not
Mhm.
even like, less than a half an hour, about a half an hour drive. Yeah, from
Mhm.
where she grew up to the beach. Never seen the ocean. And she said, only on TV.
Wow.
And so I was like, okay. I dropped everything. We went to the beach. And but see, I got to have the experience of seeing their faces the first time they ever saw the ocean, the first time they ever went to the beach. And that was priceless.
What was it like? What was the reaction?
Shocked, but the pleasant kind of shock, like um, mouth, jaw drops, eyes widen, and deep breath in. In a positive way, right?
Mhm.
And Rainbow jumped up and down and said, it looks just like it does on TV, just like it does on TV. And of course, even though they didn't have their suits, they still played in the sand, put their feet in the water, ran around. I actually have pictures of it. It's I don't know how thrilled their foster mom was when I took them home and they were kind of like wet and sandy. But I mean, that's a priceless experience.
So towards the end, when their dad got custody of them back, what was going through your mind?
That's a great question. So I had written a report stating that the court had not been able to prove that their father wasn't drinking anymore, and he was an alcoholic. Um, they I recommended against reunification. The social worker recommended against reunification, and the judge went against what we both thought,
Hmm.
and gave the father extra time beyond what they legally have to give them, and reunified them with their father. Unfortunately, their father, I was right. He had not stopped drinking. And they ended up in a situation where they were neglected, but they were older now. So even though there were still, not just myself, but other people filed CPS reports, they were not taken away again. And I think that's why some people maybe don't touch on foster care in the first place, because they're worried of having their own hearts broken, right? Because if you think about it, you're like, how sad is that, right? You don't get to see the kids anymore. Their dad's an alcoholic. But the way I see it is I was able to touch their lives,
Yeah.
right? Their foster mom was able to touch their lives in a way that they might never have been touched.
Hmm.
And they're able to see another world and to know that there are consistent adults out there that care about them. So it's a certain mindset you have to cultivate.
Yeah. How did you cultivate it? How long did that take you?
That's a good question. So after they were unified with their father in 2017, January, I still saw them until September of 2018. So I was still able to see them for a while, including I took them 2 summers. I took
Oh.
them to my house
Mhm.
for 6 weeks in the summer. So I was very close to them, very close to them. And that's also how I ended up knowing all about what was going on in their house, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
of that close contact that we kept. Um,
So you're
and
allowed to see them again, but the foster mom wasn't able to, right?
she saw them twice or three times after that. They also stayed with her for like a week
Mm-hmm.
at a time. And then with her, what happened is their dad stopped calling her back.
Mm-hmm.
when she would call to check in or to try to, see if she could get together with them. He just stopped calling her back. And then with me, he sort of let it fade out. So when I realized that he had kind of pulled the plug, because he was not very direct about it. He just started saying like, "Oh, not now, maybe next time." And then I was like, "Oh, there is no next time."
Mm-hmm.
Okay. um, I feel like I was sad and I was hurt, but it was all about the bigger picture. I had to wrap my head around that. This is about a bigger picture. This is about them, not about me, right? It's not about my heartbreak. I'll get over a heartbreak, right? But a difference in their lives is so much bigger than that. So I guess coming to terms or coming up with that mindset is what allows you to do things like that, you know?
Yeah. So these were the two girls you were being an advocate for. And in the beginning, you were, I guess, sort of dipping your toe in the water to see what it would be like to volunteer for CASA. So at
Hmm.
what point did it really confirm to you that, oh, okay, this is the meaningful thing that I've been seeking, and this is it?
Hmm.
When would you say that happened for you?
Mm-hmm. I'd say it was with them,
Like the
just
first week
looking into
or?
their eyes.
Mhm.
And um, I'd say after a short time with them, it was just so clear to me what an impact it was, if that makes sense. It was an impact for very few people, but such a big impact, right? So the impact on them and their lives was so immense and so, I can't think of the right word, deep maybe, that it was clear to me that this was where I wanted to be. And it also helped me to understand, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about adopting kids from foster care. And I've had people tell it to me when I tell them that I'm going to adopt from foster care, right? Then the first thing is like, "Oh, aren't there a lot of drug babies in foster care?" And, "Oh, yeah, I've heard about foster kids that like burn down houses and hurt animals." And, "Oh, I could never be a foster parent. I mean, what if they take the kid back?" These are just some common, I don't know, almost stereotypes.
Mhm.
I mean, the stereotype's not the right word, but just what you hear a lot about foster care.
Right.
But these girls, I was in love with them, so in love with them. I mean, I could have adopted them. They could have, uh, we could have been a family. It would have been totally fine. It just made it so clear to me that given the right environment, not all the time, but a lot of times will really turn things around for a kid, you know? And I knew I could do it. I knew I could be an adoptive parent with them. It was clear to me, clear as a bell.
Hmm. So after they went back with their dad, were you paired with another foster kid?
Um, I was not, and the reason is after they went back with their dad, shortly after, I started the process to become a foster adopt parent, and it is a conflict of interest to be a CASA and a foster parent at the same time because the CASA is on the inside of the court process and the foster parent is on the outside. You can't be on the inside and outside at the same time, if
Hmm.
that makes sense.
Yeah,
You're not allowed to. Yeah. So in order to become a foster adopt parent, I had to stop being a CASA.
I see. So those two girls were the only girls you were advocates for, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Hmm.
So now that you are in the foster system, what does that mean?
So I'm not in the system. I'm a licensed foster adopt parent.
Mm,
So um, foster adopt is basically you're a foster parent first and an adoptive parent second. So you have a child placed with you who is in foster care. And if the ultimate goal of foster care is always reunification with the biological parent or a family member. So the child lives with you, and if they do not reunify with their parent or other family member, then you have first priority to adopt the child. So you only adopt a child who is not able to reunify with their parent.
Is that common or rare for them to be reunified?
It's a good question. It depends on the situation. There's some situations that are more cut and dry and some that are sort of murky. Um, but I want to say, gosh, I don't have a statistic on it, but I'd say more than half don't reunify. But that's just if I'm remembering correctly. A little over half don't reunify.
Mm. And you're not fostering any children yet, right? But you're
Not yet.
expecting to soon?
I sure hope so. I'm approved. I have a license. I have my house is considered open. So I'm at that stage where you're waiting for a call, you know?
How long does this stage usually last for?
It totally depends. COVID has, of course, changed this drastically also. They're in kind of a unique, different situation due to COVID. And the number of kids in care is also affected by that. So I'll give you an example. You know how most schools are virtual now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not face to face. So a huge number of kids coming into care is tipped off by teachers,
Mm-hmm.
right? So teachers are often the first line of notification to CPS. And since kids aren't in school, it's very difficult to report CPS issues or even realize that they're happening in a virtual environment. So that has affected the number of kids in care right now. And also, due to COVID precautions, they're not going into houses as much as they normally would. Yeah, it's kind of a funny time. But the thought is, by some social workers I've talked to, is that once we have a vaccine, things open up and schools open back up, there will be a large number of children, unfortunately, coming into care.
Mm-hmm.
And I know they'll need foster adopt parents more than ever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in the meantime, they're basically at home with their biological parents, but not in like good environments, and they're just.
It's hard to say. Yeah, it's hard to say what's going on right now. In many ways, right?
Yeah. So what are the process to become to be accepted as a foster parent? Do you have to go through some courses?
Uh-huh. Oh yeah. Yeah, I think something that deters people also is all of the trainings you have to do, right? And it's a very personal process. So you have to fill out a lot of paperwork. You have to be fingerprinted for the FBI and DOJ.
Oh.
You have to have a medical exam to show that you are fit to be a parent. Any kind of medical information has to be disclosed to them. And then they have to do very personal interviews with you. And if you have a spouse, they will do interviews separately and then interviews together with questions as personal as telling them about the regularity of your sex life, like that type of personal questions. Yeah. And they also have to inspect your house to make sure that it's up to code, up to their standards. And if it's not that big of a deal. If it's not, they just tell you everything you have to change, and then they have to come back and visit again. And this includes things like your water temperature.
For what?
Yes. So the reason they want your base water temperature to be in our case, it was too hot, to be lower, because many people turn on the tap and the water gets too hot and burns babies and small children.
Okay.
But that's what I mean. There's like all these hoops you have to jump through, right? Like including turning down my water heater, which was that was an interesting one. I was like, what? I'm like, I want to take care of a child.
So how long did the whole process take for you to be accepted?
Unfortunately, again, COVID affected this. So it started in April of 19. I was going to be gone for the summer, and I started the process by filling out the initial paperwork and told them I'll be gone for the summer I think I was gone through September or something. And I said, when I get back, we can start with the rest of the paperwork. I just wanted to get this initial stuff going. I did the initial meeting. You have to attend a meeting. Oh, and I forgot to tell you about all the trainings, right?
Yeah.
There are hours and hours of trainings. We had to drive to Sacramento and attend like half day and day long trainings multiple times, like 4-hour trainings, 6-hour trainings, um, on parenting skills. Um, yeah, all kinds of stuff.
What was like one memorable training you had to go through?
The most memorable training was probably this type of discipline that they want you to use, where you have to um, positively reinforce literally everything they do.
Mm.
And they gave examples, and one of them was, for example, if a child, let's say it's a child that has tantrums and sometimes like hits, let's say they like swung at you but didn't hit you. One of this is like an example video that they had. They were like, "Oh, wow, thank you for not making contact when you hit. I'm so I'm so happy you didn't actually hit me. I know you were angry and I know you were having a meltdown, but you didn't actually make contact. That's great." And when I was watching this training, I just remember being like, huh, well, this is an interesting approach.
Yeah.
So,
So I mean, so you teach too as your
mhm.
main profession. Have you tried any of those training techniques yourself in your classroom?
No,
No.
I have not. I have not. Um, I have classroom management uh, slash discipline technique that I learned when I first started teaching that I find to be very effective. And I stick to it because, at least for me, it really works, and it works on lots of different kind of kids. I feel like my experience teaching has helped me with discipline strategies more than the trainings that I attended through the FOSTA program.
Hmm. Yeah. But if you do get your foster child, you have to use their methods, right? You can't use your teacher's methods.
Well, you don't really have the only thing you can't do is you cannot be physical with the child.
Hmm.
Like you cannot hit the child, you cannot spank the child, you cannot verbally abuse the child or emotionally abuse the child. So, for example, going to bed with no dinner, that's not an option,
Hmm.
or calling the child names, you can't do that. But they don't really I mean, this is just a training that they're offering, and I guess hoping that you'll use, but it's not, they can't really require you to do that. I mean, they only come visit you like once a month. I don't know how they could really
Right.
enforce a
Yeah.
discipline method, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. So do you get to state your preference for like, oh, I would prefer a kid under 10 or a boy or a
Mm,
girl?
yeah, that's a good question. So when you're filling out your paperwork, they absolutely have all of that. And they even have by race.
Hmm.
Crazy as that still sounds, but yes, they have. So they have gender, they have age limitations, and race. So if you don't feel comfortable with a child of a certain race, you can specify that. I was kind of blown away when they had that on there. I was like, what? But yes, it's there. Um, and you can also fill out like, I would like a child from 5 to 10, or a child from 0 to 2, or some people just want teenagers. That's pretty rare, but it happens. Um, some people want school age children because they already work, so they want the child to be able to go to school.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Do you have a
So the
preference?
um, I do, but it's age based.
Hmm.
It's primarily probably 0 to 5,
Hmm.
0 to 5, just because I feel like early intervention is key with helping most, not all, but
Hmm.
most issues. And I feel like if I have a chance to start with a child at a younger age, I will be able to better address any kind of issues that they might have in regards to their past and
Hmm.
their trauma.
Yeah. Is that age range more commonly available into the system or
So
rare?
apparently it depends where. It depends where, what county you're in. There's a lot of factors. Um, I used to live in Monterey County. That's where I was a CASA for Princess and Rainbow. And there, they had a lot of young children available. That was their influx. They couldn't find foster parents for these young children and were placing them out of county because they couldn't find enough. Like that's how overloaded they were with young children.
Young being
And
younger than 5?
yes, and they had a lot of foster parents that only wanted school-age children because they worked.
I see.
Yeah, so that was a big issue in Monterey County. But so the agency I'm with now is actually a private agency that works with lots of different counties. And they said now in their agency, they have a lot of people that want to adopt babies. So they don't have, I guess if you want to adopt a baby or a toddler, it might be a longer wait because of that. So it just, what I found is that it depends a lot on the county and also what's going on in the moment, because there's different times when they get, they'll get an influx of older kids due to XYZ, or they'll get an influx of younger kids due to a number of factors.
So given that you are teaching full time, like if you do get someone who is younger than 5, how would you balance it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I plan on first taking leave, of course. So now in California, receiving a foster child is like you could go on maternity leave, basically. It's the same thing. It's the same type of leave. So I would go out on leave at first, and then I'm not 100% sure, depending on the age of the child, depending on a couple of factors. One of the options I've thought is depending on their age, maybe they can start preschool. That's a possible option, but again, that would be more like a toddler. But if they're younger, because you can't start preschool till you're probably 2 most of the time, then I would have to look into other options, including daycares and or someone to help me.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure yet.
And your ultimate goal would be to eventually adopt a foster child?
Would be to adopt through foster care. And then of course I have plans to travel.
Nice. What's the difference between like foster to adopt and just adopting directly?
Good question. So in the foster to adopt program, you're a foster parent first and an adoptive parent second, right? So you take a child who's actually still in foster care and write out the case. And if they reunify and they leave, or they terminate parental rights and then you adopt them. If you're just an adoptive parent, there's different kinds of adoption in the US. There's private domestic, and that's probably a lot of people have heard of that. That's where you go through trainings, you make a book, and then if a mother is pregnant and wants to give her child up for adoption, she looks through the book, right? And then she chooses a parent, and then through a private agreement, that parent adopts that child. So that's, I guess, what most people think of as regular adoption. But you can also do regular adoption through foster care. And what that is that parental rights have already been terminated. So it's a child or children. A lot in foster care, there's a lot of sibling groups. So there's a lot of like multiples going on. If their parental rights have already been terminated, then there's people that only take those kiddos. And they're definitely going for adoption because the parents are basically already out of the picture at that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Now, what made you decide to foster to adopt instead of adopting directly?
Yeah, good question. For me, it's also about the need. They need foster parents. They need people to care about these kids while they're in the system, right? Even if they do end up reunifying, they need to be in a place where people love them. They need to be in that loving environment, and I think I can provide that.
I see. This is a fascinating interview. Learning so much. So interesting. So I want to take a step back. So you've kind of discovered this purpose during your 30s, right? What kind of advice would you give to someone who was going through what you were feeling before that? Feeling kind of lost, unfulfilled, searching for something more meaningful. What sort of advice would you give them?
That's a really good question. I'd say the best advice I could offer would be to learn about yourself, right? I feel like for so many years, I was just trying to find myself and figure out who I was, what I wanted and what I needed, right? And that can be quite a process, right? I don't think
Mhm.
for any of us it's just like snap your fingers and oh, there it is. That's who I
Yeah.
am. But I would say that that's the most important thing to do before you dive into anything really big, right? Because if you know who you are and what you want, it's so much easier to guide yourself in the right direction. So that finding yourself process can be tricky, but it's something you want to focus on before you pick that purpose.
Yeah. Was there some sort of experience that you've had that gave you more clarity to figure out what worked and what didn't?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, trial and error too, right? Trial and error is always a great way to figure out what works for you and what doesn't. But it's also, I feel like for me, it was also learning to slow down, slow my own mind down. I practice meditation.
Mm,
I started practicing years ago at this point, and just learning to sort of take a step back and reflect. That's what helped me. That was another thing. Reflect. Reflecting on, for let's say, or I mentioned trial and error, right? And something, let's say something went wrong. Then taking the time to reflect. Why was that wrong? Why was that? Why didn't that work for me? And what I felt like was once I learned about myself and I figured out kind of, I mean, I don't know if we're also always changing, right? So it's so hard for me to say I figured out who I was and that's who I am the rest of my life. Like that's wrong, right? I'm
mm,
I'm constantly changing
yeah.
and evolving as a person. But just to, when I learned to understand myself better, suddenly I didn't want to focus on myself anymore. I wanted to focus on others and I wanted to focus on um, being a part of something bigger, right? Being a part of a community and a society and giving back to that, you know? I feel like when I was younger, I was so selfish. It was all about me. And I was like, me, 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 me. But once I took that time to slow down and learn more about myself, it suddenly wasn't about me anymore. It was like I
Sudden-
was kind of insignificant.
It just happened suddenly. You had some sort of awakening, would you say?
I'd say it was more of a slow process of reflecting, meditating, trial and error, reflecting, meditating, trial and error. So I would say it was more of an evolution. There you go. More of an evolution. It wasn't just one moment, but it was a period of time of reflecting, meditating, trial and error. And when I started looking inside, like with that reflection, that's when I really started being able to process and figure it out.
Hmm. Yeah. So you started off with like an awareness that something isn't right. Then you started working
Yes.
on yourself, and then you
Yes.
decide, and then you kind of figure out your higher calling as the next stage, right?
Mhm. Yep. That's
And
exactly right.
yeah, yeah. How long did that process take?
Maybe something around a year and a half, I'd say.
Hmm.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have that um, answer, that instant
Yeah,
gratification of yeah, this is what I want to do. Yay, light bulb clicks. That's it.
right.
No, mine was more of a journey.
Yeah, it is. That's why this podcast is called A Work in Purpose, you know? All right, Jessica, now is the time. We're going to go into the lightning round where I'm going to ask you a bunch of rapid fire questions and you can just answer with one word or the sentence. Are you ready?
I am.
All right. What's one thing you like to do to relax?
Read.
What's one thing you like to do for fun?
Talk to friends.
What's one habit you are working on?
Negative habit or positive habit?
Positive.
Positive habit, yoga.
Nice. What's one habit you would like to have?
Disciplined writing.
Mm. If you're not doing what you are doing today, what would you be doing?
Teaching abroad.
Hmm. Where at?
I'm not sure. Somewhere I've never been before.
Okay. How would you describe your ideal life?
My ideal life would have a family and I would be able to travel with my family so that both I could grow as a person and my child and or children could grow as global citizens, as people, They could be educated in a way that they could never be educated in a regular school, so that they could learn about themselves as well.
Nice. Are you allowed to travel internationally with foster children?
Good question. I know I say that a lot, right?
Ask good questions.
um, um, so when a child is in foster care, they're technically a ward of the state. So
Mhm.
what that means is that their legal guardian is actually the state of California.
Mhm.
So normally you cannot take them out of the country. You can request permission from a judge,
Mm.
and normally they will give you permission to take them to another state. But generally speaking, from what I understand, it's rare that they grant permission for you to take them to another country.
Mhm.
So the traveling would out of the US, outside of the US, would probably come after adoption.
Mhm. Got it. Okay. Next question is, how do you define purpose?
A purpose is something that you work towards, something that, like a long-term goal that you want to achieve for yourself.
And are there any last requests you would like our listeners to do?
Something I'd love your listeners to do would be to check out a book called A Forever Family: Fostering Change One Child at a Time by Rob Shear. And the reason that I highly recommend this book is that the person that wrote it was in foster care himself, and then he became a foster adopt parent to 4 children in the Washington, D.C. area. So I love this story because you get half the time you get the perspective of him as a child and his experience with foster care. And then the other half of the time, you get the perspective of him as a foster parent, on the journey to adopt his 4 children. So I feel like that has just a great educating all around perspective. And then a movie that I recommend is actually very funny. It's called Instant Family. And the reason that I highly recommend this movie is that the writer, Sean Anders, he's actually a writer also for Dumb and Dumber, but he is a foster adopt parent himself. He adopted 3 siblings out of the foster care system, I believe in Los Angeles.
Cool.
So,
And do you want them to check out the website of CASA too?
absolutely. And to explain something, CASA is in every county in the United States. So each county has their own CASA organization. So make sure that you look for the CASA that's in your county to contact them. But I will give you the website for the general CASA organization across the US.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jessica, for taking the time to speak with a Working Purpose podcast. It was lovely hearing about this fascinating world of foster to adopt world and CASA. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wing. I appreciate it.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode and learned more about the foster care system in the US. If you're interested in learning more or becoming a CASA volunteer yourself, please check out the link in the show notes. If there is one key takeaway on finding your purpose from Jessica's story, is that there is probably already an inner calling you've been wanting or meaning to do, but you might not have gained clarity on what that is yet. That is why self-inquiry work like meditation is such a powerful tool to help you uncover what that inner calling is. And once it is uncovered, take action. See how and where you can volunteer like Jessica did and explore and deepen this calling. After awareness, action is your most important next step in becoming a work in purpose. Thank you for listening. If you would like to support this podcast, please subscribe, tell your friends about it, and rate it 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. Please also follow A Work in Purpose on Instagram and join our group on Facebook. May your present moment, now and forever, be filled with light and love. Until next time, this is Wing, and you are listening to A Work in Purpose.